A U.S. Navy FA-18 drops a precision munition. The Iranian tanker Sevda erupts in flames. Smoke is still rising the next morning, visible from space. Sailors are dead. And yet the White House says the ceasefire is holding. Iran says it will launch a heavy assault on every American asset across the Middle East if one more of its ships is touched. So here is the question the entire world is now asking. If jets are firing, sailors are dying, and tankers are burning, what exactly are we calling a ceasefire? Welcome to one of the most dangerous and underreported standoffs in modern history. What is unfolding right now in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz is not background noise. It is a live military confrontation between the United States and Iran, dressed up in the language of diplomacy and held together by nothing more than mutual fear of what comes next. By the end of this video, you will understand three things that most news coverage is missing entirely. First, why the legal and military logic of this so-called ceasefire has broken down in ways that make another full escalation almost inevitable. Second, what is actually happening to real people, the sailors, the civilians, the commuters paying record gas prices on both sides of this conflict. And third, the single secret that Iran's supreme leader believes gives him leverage over the entire global economy, a secret his own advisor compared this week to having an atomic bomb. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe now and hit the bell, because when this breaks, and it will break, you will want to know the moment it happens. Let's start with exactly what happened in the past 48 hours. Friday, May 9th, 2026, U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornets attacked two Iranian-flagged oil tankers, the Sevda and the Sea Star 3, in the waters near the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Central Command confirmed the strikes, stating both vessels were violating the American blockade of Iranian ports. These were not the first. They were the third and fourth Iranian ships disabled by U.S. fighter jets in recent days. Satellite imagery taken the following morning showed the Sevda still trailing a long plume of smoke from its rear section, the vessel drifting at the eastern edge of the strait. CENTCOM released footage showing the moment of impact. Flames, black smoke, a vessel engulfed. The night before the tanker strikes, things were already deteriorating fast. On May 7th, three U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Mason, the USS Truxtun, and the USS Rafael Peralta, transited the Strait of Hormuz. Iran fired missiles and other weapons at all three ships. None were struck. U.S. military officials said American forces responded by hitting Iranian military facilities. At least one sailor aboard a cargo vessel was killed in that exchange, and 10 others were injured, according to a news agency affiliated with Iran's judiciary. Saturday morning, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a formal warning. Any further attacks on Iranian ships would trigger what they called a heavy assault on U.S. assets throughout the Middle East. Meanwhile, in Miami, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat down with Qatar's Prime Minister, still trying to get Iran to respond to a peace proposal that has been on the table for days. President Trump told reporters he expects to hear from Iran very soon. As of this broadcast, Tehran has not responded. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you need to understand how fast and how completely this situation collapsed from a war into a ceasefire into something that has no name. The war itself began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes against Iran. The scale, timing, and coordination of those strikes were unprecedented in the modern Middle East. Iran reeled. Within weeks, the critical question became not whether the U.S. could hit Iran, but whether anyone could stop what came next. The Strait of Hormuz is why. Roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through that narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. Iran does not need nuclear weapons to hold the world hostage. It simply needs to close that strait. And it did. By early March, major shipping companies, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, had suspended all transits. By March 10, only 15 ships had made it through in the entire month. The global energy market convulsed. On April 8th, the U.S. and Iran agreed to a ceasefire. Pakistan brokered the deal through intense negotiations involving J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Iran's foreign minister. Relief was short-lived. Within days, Iran began charging tolls of over $1 million per ship transiting the strait. Israel launched a major strike on Beirut, killing the leader of Hezbollah's elite Radwan forces. Iran said that violated the deal. On April 12th, the Islamabad talks, the formal negotiation framework, collapsed. J.D. Vance announced the failure himself. Trump responded on April 13 by imposing a full naval blockade of Iranian ports. No ships entering or leaving. CENTCOM began turning vessels around. Iran began firing. And here we are. We told you at the beginning that this ceasefire is being held together by nothing more than mutual fear. Here is what we now know, and it is worse than even that framing suggests, because the fear is starting to lose. Donald Trump is the central figure on the American side, and his posture has been strikingly contradictory. He has simultaneously insisted the ceasefire is holding, described Iranian cities as at risk of a catastrophic glow if no deal is reached, and told reporters that if there is no ceasefire, people will not need to be told. They will simply see it. His administration is operating on a dual track: military pressure through the blockade and tanker strikes, and diplomatic outreach through Witkoff and Rubio. Marco Rubio has taken a harder public line, framing the current standoff as proof that Iran cannot be trusted to self-enforce any agreement. Steve Witkoff, Trump's personal envoy, has been the quiet architect of negotiations, traveling to Doha, meeting with Qatar's prime minister, and serving as the back channel to Tehran. On the Iranian side, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei remains the ultimate decision-maker, and he has said almost nothing publicly since the ceasefire began. That silence is itself a form of power. His foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, has been the public face of Iran's position, posting on social media that every time a diplomatic solution nears, the U.S. chooses military adventure instead. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, is the operational force executing the threats at sea. They are not under the conventional Iranian military chain of command in the same way. They answer to Khamenei directly. Their threat of heavy assault is not bureaucratic language. It is a strategic signal. Pakistan and Qatar are the indispensable mediators. Pakistan's Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, has said his country has been in contact with both sides around the clock. Qatar, which hosts a major U.S. military base and maintains strong ties with Iran, is the diplomatic bridge neither side can afford to burn. Set aside the diplomacy for a moment and look at what is actually happening to human beings. On board the tanker Sevda, sailors worked in a vessel that was struck by a military jet, set on fire, and left burning through the night. Iranian state media reported at least one sailor killed and 10 injured in connected strikes. These are not abstractions. They are merchant mariners who went to work on an oil tanker and did not come home. Inside Iran, the energy situation is deteriorating in ways that rarely make Western headlines. Iranian officials have begun formally encouraging the population to reduce electricity and gas consumption. The reason is direct. The U.S. blockade has cut off the flow of energy imports and revenue that Iran's domestic supply chain depends on. Fuel shortages are real. For ordinary Iranians, this war is showing up at the power switch. For ordinary Americans, it is showing up at the gas pump. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States is currently more than $1 higher than it was 1 year ago. U.S. consumer sentiment has hit a fresh record low. People feel the economic squeeze, even if they cannot always trace it to a naval blockade in the Persian Gulf. Near Iran's main crude export terminal at Kharg Island, an oil slick covering 71 square kilometers has been spreading across the Persian Gulf, the equivalent of roughly 80,000 barrels already spilled, with satellite imagery showing oil still leaking from the terminal. 230 loaded oil tankers remain stranded inside the Persian Gulf, unable to exit, their cargo worth billions, their crews waiting. Here is the part that no one in mainstream coverage is giving enough attention to, and it changes the entire strategic picture of this conflict. If you are finding this analysis valuable, subscribe now and hit the bell. We are about to get to the most important part of this story. The world is watching this with the controlled panic of someone watching a house fire from next door, hoping the wind does not shift. China has continued to import oil from Iran despite the effective blockade. Beijing's foreign ministry has expressed concern about tankers with Chinese crew members being struck, calling U.S. military action dangerous and destabilizing. China is Iran's largest oil customer. The blockade hits China's energy security directly, and Beijing's quiet defiance of it, buying Iranian crude through intermediary networks, is one of the structural factors that gives Tehran the financial oxygen to keep holding out. South Korea, which imported more than 60% of its crude through the Strait of Hormuz last year, has capped domestic prices on gasoline and petroleum products to shield its population from market shock. One tanker that passed through the strait in mid-April arrived off South Korea's coast last week, carrying 1 million barrels of crude, a near-heroic transit that was celebrated quietly in energy markets. The United Kingdom has deployed HMS Dragon, a Royal Navy destroyer, to the region as part of a multinational mission co-led with France to protect international shipping when conditions allow transit through the strait. That deployment is significant because it signals that Washington's allies are positioning for a post-conflict reopening, not assuming the standoff ends well. The UAE has been under missile and drone attack from Iran on multiple days, with Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's CEO warning that 230 tankers remain stranded inside the Gulf despite ceasefire claims. The UAE's energy chief said the strait was demonstrably still not open, regardless of what any government announced. Social media response has been intense, split predictably along geopolitical lines, with Iranian accounts documenting burning ships and mourning sailors, and American accounts focused on the military's enforcement of the blockade as lawful and proportionate. Here is what is not getting enough attention, and it matters enormously. An advisor to Iran's supreme leader said this week, publicly, on record, that control over the Strait of Hormuz is equivalent to possessing an atomic bomb. He said Iran had long neglected this strategic asset and that it would not be relinquished under any circumstances. That statement is extraordinary, and here is why. Iran's nuclear program has been the stated centerpiece of U.S. demands in every set of peace negotiations. The U.S. position is that any deal must include a rollback of Iran's disputed nuclear capabilities. But if Tehran's strategic calculus has shifted, If the Strait of Hormuz has become Iran's real deterrent, its true weapon of mass leverage, then the nuclear issue may be a sideshow to something far more durable and far harder to negotiate away. You cannot inspect a strait. You cannot dismantle a coastline. Geography does not respond to UN resolutions. The implication is sobering. Even if Iran eventually agrees to nuclear concessions, it may have permanently recalibrated how it thinks about the strait as a permanent coercive instrument rather than an emergency measure. And a country that has decided the strait is its atomic bomb will be extraordinarily difficult to convince that reopening it unconditionally is in its interest. This is the structural tension beneath every day of this ceasefire that the diplomatic language of proposals and counterproposals does not begin to address. We asked at the beginning, if jets are firing, sailors are dying, and tankers are burning, what exactly are we calling a ceasefire? We now have a clearer answer. What we are calling a ceasefire is actually a race between diplomacy and the next military incident large enough that neither side can claim restraint anymore. Subscribe now if you have not already. The most critical part of this analysis is coming. The stakes of this conflict are not abstract. They are measurable, scalable, and in several cases already being felt. In the best-case scenario, Iran responds to the U.S. peace proposal with a framework agreement within the next 72 hours. Negotiations move to a formal setting. The naval blockade is scaled back incrementally. The strait reopens under monitored conditions, and both governments claim victory through different messaging. Oil markets stabilize. Gas prices begin to fall. The world exhales. In the most likely scenario, Iran delays its response. Exchanges of fire continue at the low level now established as normal. Diplomatic talks drag on through Qatar and Pakistan intermediaries for weeks or months, and the global shipping disruption persists. The human cost continues to accumulate quietly. Dead sailors, rationed electricity, record low consumer confidence, without any single event dramatic enough to force resolution. In the worst-case scenario, a U.S. or Iranian action crosses a threshold that the other side cannot absorb without a full response. The IRGC executes its heavy assault threat against U.S. assets across the Middle East. That means American bases in Iraq, Syria, Qatar, Bahrain, and potentially U.S. Navy vessels. The U.S. responds with the full-scale bombing Trump has explicitly threatened, including Iranian power plants, bridges, and infrastructure. The strait is sealed completely. Oil prices spike to levels not seen since the 1970s oil embargo. Global recession follows. Every nation that imports energy through the Persian Gulf faces immediate crisis. There is one additional dimension to the worst case that rarely gets said plainly. A full-scale war with Iran, fought simultaneously with ongoing instability in Lebanon, an already strained Israel-Hamas situation, and a fractured NATO posture in Europe, would be the most complex, multi-theater military environment the United States has faced since World War II. The logistical, diplomatic, and human resource demands would be immense. Military analysts who study the IRGC's operational doctrine note that the Revolutionary Guard's public threat of a heavy assault is not typically issued lightly. These are signals intended to be taken seriously, both as deterrence and as internal political communication to Iran's domestic audience. The IRGC's threat was specific. It named U.S. sites across the Middle East, not just forces near the strait. That specificity suggests it was coordinated at the highest levels of Iran's command. Economists tracking the energy disruption point to the dual blockade structure as historically without precedent. A major oil producer having its ports blockaded by the U.S. Navy while simultaneously restricting traffic through the world's most critical oil choke point creates compounding supply chain effects that conventional market models were not designed to handle. The 230 stranded tankers represent a deferred supply shock. The moment the strait reopens, those tankers will move simultaneously, and that surge will create its own volatility. International law scholars have raised serious questions about the legal basis of the U.S. naval blockade. CENTCOM has framed it as enforcement of the ceasefire terms, but Iran argues that attacking ships in international waters violates the existing ceasefire framework. Both positions have legal arguments behind them. That ambiguity is dangerous because it means both sides can justify almost any escalatory action as defensive and legal. Political scientists focusing on Iran's domestic politics note that the longer this standoff continues, the more Iran's government can use it to consolidate nationalist sentiment. A population suffering from electricity shortages and fuel rationing is a population that can be told it is under siege. That narrative is politically useful for the Iranian government, and it reduces the domestic pressure on Khamenei to make concessions quickly. Remember the unanswered question we started with? The one about what we are actually calling a ceasefire? Here is what all of this evidence now points to. The ceasefire is not a pause in conflict. It is conflict conducted below the threshold that either side has decided requires a formal declaration of war. That threshold is moving. And every tanker that burns, every missile that misses a destroyer by meters, every day Iran's peace proposal answer does not arrive, moves it further. 3 scenarios grounded in what we now know. Best case, Iran sends a response to the U.S. peace proposal within 72 hours. Not a final agreement, but a counterproposal that is serious enough to pause military action. Qatar's prime minister has now met directly with Witkoff and Rubio. Pakistan has been working the phones constantly. The diplomatic machinery is not broken. If Tehran decides the blockade is economically unsustainable and the military risk is escalating beyond manageable, a genuine negotiation is possible. Oil markets would recover significantly within weeks of a credible announcement. Likely case: Iran delays, continues to treat the strait as a bargaining chip, and tests U.S. resolve with additional small-scale incidents, drone attacks on the UAE, harassment of commercial vessels, IRGC provocations below the level that forces a full U.S. response. The Trump administration continues to insist the ceasefire is holding while enforcing the blockade. Diplomatic talks grind forward through intermediaries. Resolution takes months, not days. Global energy markets remain disrupted. The human cost accumulates. Worst case, a miscalculation. One U.S. ship is hit seriously enough that Trump authorizes resumption of full-scale bombing, or Iran's IRGC executes the heavy assault threat and strikes a U.S. base in Qatar or Iraq with enough casualties that the political calculus in Washington changes overnight. At that point, the ceasefire label disappears, and the world faces a war without off-ramps, fought over the most valuable waterway on Earth. The variable that matters most in the next 72 hours is simple: what Iran says. We want to hear from you because this is not a story with clean answers. Here is the first question. Iran's advisor compared the Strait of Hormuz to an atomic bomb. If that is truly how Tehran now thinks about that waterway, as a permanent strategic weapon, do you believe any peace deal can actually stick? Or are we watching the first act of a conflict that has no real resolution, only pauses? And the second question, Trump has simultaneously insisted this ceasefire is real while U.S. jets sink Iranian ships. Is that a defensible strategic ambiguity, keeping both options open? Or is it a dangerous fiction that makes the next miscalculation more likely, not less? Tell us what you think in the comments. We read every one. And if someone you know needs to understand what is actually happening in the Persian Gulf right now, share this video. That is how we get this analysis to people who need it. Here are the 3 most important things to take away from everything we have covered today. First, the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran is not functioning as a ceasefire in any traditional military or diplomatic sense. Both sides are conducting active military operations and calling them enforcement or self-defense. That definitional gap is not a technicality. It is the core danger. Second, the Strait of Hormuz has been repositioned in Iran's strategic doctrine, possibly permanently, as a coercive instrument comparable to a weapon of mass economic destruction. Any negotiated settlement that does not address that doctrine will not hold. Third, the next 72 hours are genuinely consequential. Iran's response to the U.S. peace proposal, or its continued silence, will determine whether this standoff moves toward resolution or toward the kind of incident that makes resolution impossible. Watch for 3 things in the coming days: Iran's official response to the proposal, the next CENTCOM update on vessels turned away or disabled, and whether any allied nation formally joins the U.S. blockade enforcement. Those 3 signals will tell you where this is actually heading. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could change everything. Subscribe and hit the bell, because when it breaks, we will be the first to cover it. The world's most important waterway is on fire, and the world cannot look away.